Hi, and welcome to the fourth lesson of our Changing Economic World series. In our last lesson, we were looking at something called the North-South divide. In today's lesson, we are looking at how we can solve that. Now, this is going to be quite a complex issue because, as we already know, the North-South divide is something that exists currently, and most likely it will continue to exist for a very long time. That said, there are strategies the government are trying to do to change it, and we're going to have a look at those now. In the last lesson, we were looking at what that divide was. I always put one of my favourite cartoons on here where it shows that lady offering the little ticket and saying, here's a ticket south, it could extend your life by years. And if you remember, that's because of this metaphorical divide that exists. Now, economists draw this red line here, and they argue that this is the economic north and this is the economic south. One of the key things to remember was that Wales, which is obviously a lot of it quite south, was included in the north, as were places like Birmingham. Whereas if we were to draw the line geographically, it would cut off here. So the line is drawn according to economics and social factors. And the argument was that in the north, things like life expectancy were lower. So in Liverpool, it was 75.7 years on average, whereas if you were down south in Cambridge, it'd be 79.5 years. And wages, more unemployment, black spots in the north, and also government spending tends to be higher in the south as well. And we're going to get on to that about how they're really trying to change that around. But as a kind of little summary, this is how I would describe it. If someone asked me what is a north-south divide, this is what I would say. There is a clear divide in wealth in the UK. Some regions and cities are wealthier than others, and the people that live there have a higher standard of living and can therefore even live longer. And broadly speaking, that divide mirrors the north and south pattern, and people who live in the south generally earn more per week, they generate more wealth for the UK, are less likely to be unemployed, and live longer. So all those statements in the red there, they apply to generally if you live in the south. Now, I need to be clear, this is a generalization because there are some parts of London that are in extreme levels of poverty. And there are areas of Liverpool and Manchester and Newcastle and Glasgow and Edinburgh that are also very wealthy. So this is a kind of general pattern if we were to take a holistic overall view. Now, the question we're going to look at today is well, why is that the case a bit more, and then how can we change it? And the reason it is mainly the case is because of London as an area. London dominates the UK's economy. 25% or thereabouts of the UK's GDP, so all the money and services produced in this country, is in London alone in one city, a quarter. And that stat is absolutely insane when it doesn't represent the same stat for the population. And that leads to several problems, such as there being this north-south divide. Now, if we're talking about why this happened, if we go back to our map, it all goes back to the change in UK's economy. Because in the 70s and 80s, the north would have been a powerhouse for manufacturing and the secondary industry. When that collapsed and the industry was outsourced to places like China and India, the tertiary and quaternary sector took over. Now, places like London and Cambridge took advantage of that very, very quickly, and therefore, when this new economy came into place, they were the ones that benefited from it. Whereas, generically, in the north, they were very slow to react. They were stuck in this old industrial mindset, and they could not react fast enough to the change, which meant the south grew very, very quickly, and the north started to fall behind quite dramatically. And nowadays, something happens in London, and it's called agglomeration, and it's one of my favourite words, to agglomerate. And it basically means to collect or form into a mass or a group. So let's take my analogy. We've got a company that sets up in London and does really, really well. If I am another company that does a similar thing, I might also set up in London. And over time, what's happened is is a lot of big firms have all agglomerated or collected into a group in London because they benefit from being close to each other. And that is a kind of juxtaposition for most people, because why would you want to move next to your competition? Well, the economic argument is that if you are close to each other, it makes you more productive because you want to work harder because you can see your competition, but also it allows the sharing of knowledge as well. And that sharing of knowledge has really promoted London to do so well. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of big firms all move to London, and nowadays they all agglomerate together. So if, for example, we're going to look at the financial sector in a second, if I have a new financial company opening, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to move to London because that's where all the other financial firms are. And we'll see that why that has such a big impact in a minute. So if we're looking at disposable income, this image here is showing something called disposable income. Now, disposable income is the money you have after you spend all the things you needed for life. So that money, the figure there, is the money after they've spent money on food, after they've spent money on accommodation, after they've spent money on healthcare, etc. So in inner London, the disposable income is the highest in Europe at £45,000 of disposable income. The second highest, over Bayern, which is in Munich, is 25,000, so nowhere near. The EU average is £15,000 a year of disposable income. So inner London and even outer London is way, way, way above not just the European average, but they're also number one and number three in the entire of Europe, which means that those people are wealthier than if be in Paris, in Berlin, in Amsterdam, in Moscow, etc. And that kind of feeds into this idea that London has been uber successful. So let's take that share again. And what this graph is showing is percentage of UK output. Now, basically, this is referring to the idea. So this graph is showing output by region. And what that basically means is of the total output of the UK, so all the things we export, the trade and the goods, what region does what? Now, Scotland, 8%, the east of England, 8.7%, London, 21.9%. So over a fifth of our output comes out of just London alone. Now, this still doesn't really fully explain why it generates so much money. Because all joking aside, there could be a high amount of output in Manchester at the moment or Liverpool, but it doesn't exactly explain why that has such an impact on the economy. And the reason is it's all to do with the sectors that work there. So as a percentage of the UK's total workforce, London accounted for 34% of all the jobs in the financial and insurance sectors. Now, the finance sector is one of the most valuable tertiary economies in the world. The UK and London in particular is a financial hub alongside New York, Tokyo, and Singapore. And as such, it creates a huge amount of wealth for the UK. Now, jobs in finance include things like a banker, financial planner, an insurance agent, tax preparer, accountant, any of that type of job. Now, those types of jobs are paid very, very well indeed. Now, I just typed into Google, essentially, I just typed in banker London salary, and these are the sort of things that came up. So the first one that came up was on £71,000 a year, and the one down here, the Barclays investment banker, that was starting at £112,000 a year. Now those are basic salaries. I need to be honest here. For people that work in this sector, a lot of their money also comes from added bonuses as well. So for example, this wage here of £112,000 a year would not just they would get that, they would also get maybe a bonus of £30,000 if the company did well. They would maybe get allowance for food, for transport, for cars, etc. as well. So the actual total package is much, much higher. And that type of salary is very atypical of London. Most people that work in that sector will earn between £70,000 and £120,000 on average. And it doesn't just stop there. If you became an investment banker at Barclays and then progressed up through the ranks, the people at the top of that company are earning literally millions of pounds a year. Okay, so the salaries that people are earning in London are very, very high. If we compare that to the average economy in the rest of the country. Now, because those jobs agglomerate in London, that means that the rest of the UK doesn't really have as much access to that sector. So I just looked up again, what job do most people do in the north? And one of the big things that came up for me was retail or shop worker. And I typed into Google again, and the average salary for someone who works in a shop in retail is £25,000 a year. So already we can see the huge divide between the jobs in London and the jobs that maybe exist in the rest of the country. There are two questions there. If you answer those questions now, if you pause the video, it will help you with the review questions at the end. So compare the jobs available in London and the north of the UK, and how might this lead to the north-south divide? So pause the video and then have a go. Okay, so it might lead to the north-south divide because it all goes back to this idea of tax, doesn't it, and money into the economy. So if someone's earning £70,000 a year, they're paying more tax, they are going shopping in more shops, so they raise the money and pay more tax, and therefore there is more money for that area. Whereas if the salaries are lower, the government can raise less money, and therefore per person they have less money to spend. And that's a very big political minefield, because a lot of people would argue two kind of things here. Some people might argue that that's fair, because if the money is made in London, it should stay in London, and that's why London should do so well. But other people argue that it's not fair that where you're born in the UK should mean you get less access to better education, to better healthcare, etc. So it's kind of this bit of a, like I say, a bit of a political minefield with this, really. To try and solve the problem, the UK government came up with something called the Northern Powerhouse Agenda. One agenda, one economy, one north was the famous tagline. Now, essentially, the Powerhouse proposal was to create a regional core of cities, so Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield, Hull, and Newcastle. And the argument was that by doing this, they might be able to rival London, and they might be able to kickstart the economy in the north as well. We're going to look at three things they wanted to do. So the first thing they wanted to do was improve the transport infrastructure, such as motorway development and such as HS2. We looked at this in a lesson about infrastructure, and the whole argument here was that if you improve the roads and the development and the railways, that would improve the trade capability of the north, and therefore that would improve the overall GDP of the area. So better trading. If you can get from Liverpool to Birmingham in 30 minutes, that is better than it taking an hour and a half, because you're more productive with your time, you can generate more money. The second thing they wanted to do was invest in science and innovation. So those things like science parks we looked at the moment are generally in places like Cambridge and Oxford. What they're trying to do now is they're trying to expand that quaternary industry into the north. So there's a science park being opened in Newcastle at the moment, and their whole idea there is that by entering those quaternary jobs, it will attract higher paid wages and improve the outcomes of the region. And then the last thing, this is quite tricky, it's called devolution. Now, essentially, if we make this really, really simple, an undevolved government is where Westminster, so the House of Parliament, and Boris Johnson makes the decisions for every single person in the country. However, that actually isn't entirely the case anymore. Something called devolution happened, and in terms of this topic, some northern cities and northern mayors in particular were given some of the Prime Minister's powers. So, for example, if Manchester or Greater Manchester region has £1 billion to spend. In the past, it would have been Boris telling them what to spend it on. And the Manchester mayors argued, well, hang on a minute. If we live in Manchester, we're from Manchester, why can't we decide what that money's spent on? And in a nutshell, that's what happened. So nowadays, the government of Manchester, so the local government, decide where they want to spend that money. So if they think that they need to spend it on education, that's where they'll spend it. If they decide to spend it on roads and infrastructure, that's where they'll spend it. And the argument is that that would help cities focus on what they need to improve and enable them to improve in the future. Now, in reality, you can see some flaws might appear here. If the money they are given isn't enough, it doesn't really help. And also, in some cases, they didn't do it particularly well either. But the actual premise, I think, is quite good. So, some review questions to upload to Satchel 1. The first one is, which area of the UK generates the most income and why? The second one is, compare the jobs in this area to an area in the north of the UK. If you want to extend this answer, in addition to this video lesson, if you type into Google maybe some jobs in St Helens or jobs in Liverpool, you might be able to see the average wages, and you can use that to compare to the ones in that city I was talking about. And the last one, explain the 3 ways the government is trying to reduce the north-south divide. That all links to those 3 factors I've just discussed. Feel free to rewind the video to have a look at that.